In the seventh and final video of our study on Christian character, we turn our attention to the third and final theological virtue, hope. Hope is something that's talked about all throughout the Bible. And in the New Testament, hope is something that is often depicted as a defining or distinguishing mark of what it means to be a Christian. Just think about what Paul says in his first letter to the Thessalonians in chapter 4. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. Paul doesn't say that Christians shouldn't grieve, but he does say that our grief should be distinct, different from the world around us. We should not grieve as those who have no hope, because that is what distinguishes Christians from others. Christians have hope, whereas the world around them lives in hopelessness. As Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12, remember, you were once separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel and the strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. The Apostle Peter similarly says that hope is at the heart of the Christian experience. For Christians, as he says in 1 Peter chapter 1, Christians are those who have been born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And then later in his letter, he tells us that we should be always prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. In other words, Peter thinks that hope is such a distinguishing mark of Christianity that non-Christians should notice and they should be puzzled and want to know what it is that makes Christians so hopeful. And if you read early Christian history, you'll realize that this is precisely what often happened. What their pagan neighbors often noticed about early Christians was the strange and unshakable hope that they possessed, even in the face of death. In the 2nd century, for instance, a prominent Christian philosopher named Justin was being tried for his faith and being told to renounce Christianity, which he refused to do. And his interrogator, a man named Rusticus, simply could not understand Justin's persistent refusal. So he began to ask him about the hope that seemed to be giving Justin so much courage. He said, "Are you convinced that if I have you whipped and beheaded, you'll go to heaven?" And Justin replied that yes, that was precisely his hope, and he was fully confident in it. So Rusticus said again, "So you suppose you'll ascend to heaven?" Justin responded, "I don't just suppose it, I am absolutely certain of it." That same scene is repeated over and over again throughout Christian history. From Paul and Silas singing hymns while being imprisoned in a Philippian jail, to Justin's unwavering courage before his accuser, to the countless number of Christian men and women who have endured suffering, adversity, even death itself. What has so often distinguished Christians from those around them is the hope that is in them, the hope that enables them to endure and to live well despite whatever hardship or uncertainty they face. Hope is a distinguishing mark of what it means to be Christian. But what exactly makes Christians hopeful? Or to ask it otherwise, in what do we hope as Christians? And how does hope influence the way we live? I'd like to address both of these questions, and I'd like to do so by talking first about the object of hope, and then about what I will call the obedience of hope. So first, let's talk about the object of Christian hope. Often when people talk about being hopeful or feeling hopeful, what they're referring to is a kind of positive anticipation that certain goals they have will be realized. If someone asks you, for instance, how you're feeling about an upcoming job performance review at work, you might say, I'm feeling pretty hopeful, which in that case would mean I'm optimistic that this meeting will go well and that I may be getting a raise or a promotion of some sort. Or maybe you've put a bid on a home and you're telling your friends that you're very hopeful about it, which means that you think there's a good chance your bid will be accepted. Sometimes we use the language of hope to describe a more general sense of optimism about the future. Like when a person says that she's hopeful about the future of her country. Or when a football fan says that he's feeling hopeful about the off-season moves that his team made. Neither of those refer to personal goals, nor do they even communicate specific outcomes that are being anticipated. They're just a way of saying that while we're not entirely sure what the future holds, we feel optimistic that things will turn out all right. But that is not what the Bible means when it speaks of hope. Christian hope is not a matter of us expecting that we'll be able to achieve specific goals, nor is it a kind of wishful thinking, nor is it a vague general optimism about the future. The object of Christian hope, the thing upon which we hope, is much more specific than that. Christian hope is focused specifically upon God and upon His promises to us. Notice the way that the psalmist describes his own experience of hope in Psalm 42. He begins by acknowledging that he sometimes feels hopeless. Why are you cast down, O my soul, he says. Why are you in turmoil within me? And then, speaking to his own soul, he says, hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. Why does the psalmist need hope? Because life seems to have turned against him. And in what does he place his hope? Is it in a positive or wishful attitude? Is it in his own ingenuity? No. Hope in God. That's what he tells himself. Similarly, in Psalm 33, we read, our soul waits for the Lord, for he is our help and our shield, for our heart is glad in him because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you. And again in Psalm 130, O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption. Biblical hope, then, has a very specific source and object. It doesn't arise from a general sense of optimism or from a kind of self-confidence. It arises from a confidence in God and his promises. And in the New Testament, these promises become specifically focused on the resurrection of Jesus and on the promise of our own resurrection in him. That's the living hope that Peter talks about in his letter, the one that comes through the resurrection, he says, of Jesus Christ from the dead. It's the hope that the Apostle Paul has in mind in Romans chapter 8 when he says, in hope we are saved. Jesus himself speaks of this hope in John chapter 14 when he said to his disciples, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. My point is that when we talk about Christian hope, we shouldn't confuse it with the self-confidence or the general optimism that people often have in mind when they speak about being hopeful. Christian hope isn't an expectation that things will turn out how we would like. It is a confidence that no matter how things may turn out, and no matter what difficulties or disappointments we encounter, we need not be troubled. We need not despair, for our hope is in God, in the one who raised Jesus from the dead, and the one who has promised that he will one day raise us too, that he will wipe away every tear from our eyes, that he is the one who will make all things new. This was the hope that enabled the 14th century English saint, Julian of Norwich, to make her famous statement that all shall be well and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. That's not vague optimism. That's not an anticipation of a painless life. In fact, it was in a time of enormous pain that Julian came to this realization. What made her hopeful, despite her circumstances, was that she could look to a crucified and risen Jesus and see in his face the God who had guaranteed that he would make all things well. That is the object of Christian hope. But that raises another question. If hope is confidence in God and in his promises of restoration, wouldn't hope lead to a kind of passivity among Christians? Wouldn't hoping in God's redemption and in some promise of resurrection lead us to feel kind of apathetic to what's going on around us right now? That's certainly what Karl Marx thought when he famously described religion as the opiate of the people. What he meant is that religious hope in the promise of heaven or the promise of resurrection, that kind of hope has the power to numb or anesthetize people to the problems that they face. Religious hope is what keeps a beaten down and a mistreated working class from rising up and taking charge and doing something about the injustices that they face. Religious hope makes people passive and inactive. Or at least so thought Marx. But I disagree. I would suggest that Christian hope, biblical hope, doesn't hold us back from action. It's actually what enables us to act. Hope is what gives us the ability to live as God has called us to live. Hope, true hope, leads not to apathy, but to courageous obedience. And to explain what I mean, I want to begin with something that C.S. Lewis said in his book, Mere Christianity. Hope, Lewis said, is not, as some modern people think, a form of escapism or wishful thinking. It does not mean that we are to leave the present world as it is. If you read history, you will find that the Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought most of the next. The apostles themselves, who set on foot the conversion of the Roman Empire, the great men who built up the Middle Ages, the English evangelicals who abolished the slave trade, all left their mark on earth precisely because their minds were occupied with heaven. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this. What all of these historical examples demonstrate, in other words, is that hope doesn't need to lead to apathy or passivity or inaction. Hope is what will direct our action and what enables us to endure. Even when we face hardship and persecution and loss, hope, in other words, is not a virtue that somehow allows us to sit back and do nothing. Hope is a virtue that we need in order to do something. Lewis mentions multiple historical examples, the apostles, the English evangelicals. There are countless others that we could add, but I'd like to mention just one as an example. Martin Luther King Jr. He was not a perfect man. He had faults, he made mistakes, but I don't think anyone could argue that Martin Luther King was a man who lived and acted with courage, a man who was used by God to bring about incredible social reform. But if you know anything about MLK's life and his years of political activism, you'll know it was certainly not without hardship. He faced enormous opposition. He was ridiculed, despised, slandered, imprisoned. He and his family alike were threatened on numerous occasions. And ultimately, he was shot and killed for doing what he believed in. But for as long as he was alive, he persevered, even when it got tough. And what enabled him to do so was a kind of unwavering, confident hope. a hope that arose not from an optimism about the innate goodness of the American public, not from a belief in his own ability to bring about change. What enabled Martin Luther King to organize and speak and write and persevere was his hope in the God of the Bible and in the promises that God made about the kingdom he was bringing to bear. In one of the final sermons he preached, less than 4 months before he was killed, Dr. King spoke about this hope, the hope that animated all of his activism, the hope that kept him going despite the opposition he faced, the hope he had referenced in his famous speech upon the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. In this sermon, some 4 years after that speech at Ebenezer Baptist Church, he said, "I still have a dream today, that one day war will come to an end, that men will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, that nations will no longer rise up against nations, neither will they study war anymore. I still have a dream today, that one day the lamb and the lion will lie down together, and every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid. I still have a dream today that one day every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill will be made low. The rough places will be made smooth, and the crooked places straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. I still have a dream that with this faith we will be able to adjourn the councils of despair and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. With this faith we will be able to speed up the day when there will be peace on earth and goodwill toward men. It will be a glorious day. The morning stars will sing together and the sons of God will shout for joy." Martin Luther King had a dream, a hope that spurred him into action and enabled him to endure. And that dream wasn't the result of wishful thinking or just a kind of general optimism. All of those things that King spoke about in his dream, they all come from specific biblical promises that God gave in his word. Because that is what gave Martin Luther King his hope. That is what enabled him to obey the call God had given him. Because hope, true hope, is hope in God. And true hope doesn't leave us passive. It is what enables us to live lives that are just, courageous, prudent, temperate, faithful, and loving. We do not need only one or two of these virtues. If we're going to live well, if we're going to be people of character, then we need them all.